r/AskReddit cops of Reddit, what has so far been the creepiest call you've ever had to respond to and what happened? Story 1. 911 dispatcher reporting in. Received a call from an elderly lady who had trouble breathing. I had taken several calls from her and her husband in the past, so I recognized her voice. I dispatched an ambulance to her residence and held her on the line, trying to keep her calm while the ambulance was responding. Ambulance advised that they have 15-minute ETA. She lived in a very rural part of WV. I'm talking to her, asking about her husband and how he was doing and just making small talk with her. The ambulance calls in and advises they are on scene, and I let them know that she is in severe respiratory distress and I still had her on the line. I let her know the ambulance is coming to the door to go answer the door, and she says okay and hangs up the phone. Pretty normal, yeah. Well, here's where it gets weird. The EMT and paramedic on scene call back about a minute later and advises no one is answering the door. We have a sheriff unit who was in the area pulling on scene about that time. The sheriff unit confirmed the address and advised he is breaching the door to make access to the PT. 5 minutes go by and the paramedic on scene radios in asking who the caller was. I advise it was the elderly female who lived at the residence. He tells me that he's going to call in and needs to speak with the supervisor on shift. We get him over to the supervisor and the supervisor confirms the information that I gave him and asks what's going on. Apparently the elderly female had been dead for a while and was already in full rigor mortis. They thought I was wrong on the caller, but the other dispatchers played it back and confirmed that it was the female who called. The ambulance transferred the hospital and we got the same calls and disbelief from the doctors. So, I took a call from a ghost. Story 2. I am interning with a sheriff's police department, so most of my time is spent on patrol. We got called out to do a wellness check, which the deputy thought was going to be a piece of cake, like she was out of town or something. We get there and are met by the neighbors who told us that the mail is piling up in the mailbox and that there are several untouched packages on the porch. Okay, so we go up the house and the front door is unsecured. So we crack open the door a couple of inches and the deputy calls inside. But the door won't move anymore. The house was one of those split houses where the stairs meet at the front door and the upstairs and downstairs are offset, so we concluded that there might be stuff behind the door. It's about this time that the deputy tells me that she is a known hoarder and that could be why the door was stuck. He also mentions that if we see flies on the inside of the windows, she is most likely inside and deceased. As we walk around the side of the house, we notice a lot of flies on the windows. The back door was locked, and as we looked in, we noticed bags on bags of garbage diapers and miscellaneous shit all over the place. We head back to the front and attempt to make entry. He pushes the door open, this time with more force, and from underneath I see a grease-like liquid spreading out from under the door. The deputy stops, closes the door, and calmly tells me that the lady was indeed dead and wedged behind the door. From the dates of the packages, we concluded that she had been gone about 2 months. Once we did make entry into the house, I was allowed inside. After 2 months, she didn't even look like a human corpse. Her skin and body had sagged and melted to the floor, and her face was all black and had been eaten to the bone by maggots. I'll never forget the smell when the coroners moved her and she popped. It was like a physical presence. Whatever those people get paid to deal with that shit, it's not enough. The thing that really got to me, though, was wondering if she had fallen down the stairs and died there, or if she fell and was unable to move and waited for help that would never come. Story 3. Went to a welfare check. A neighbor called in he hasn't seen this guy for a few days and the lights have been on for a while. I go and look around and find no footprints or tire marks in the snow. Recent storm. I checked the garage and nothing. I checked the house, which was unlocked, and found the guy's cell phone, keys, wallet, and cash with the TV on. That's when I realized this was now a dead body search. I looked everywhere in and outside the house and around the garage. There were several old junk vehicles on the property, but again, no tire marks or shoe prints or anything. I call all recent numbers on his phone and no one's heard from him. Only so much I can do, so I issue a BOL and we start getting NCIC paperwork ready. Next day, the day shift officer goes over to follow up. Turns out the guy was plowing his driveway and either had a medical condition or something and either passed out or died on the spot and crashed the truck onto the other junk cars, which then caught on fire. Edit. Investigation leads to the fact this happens a week before I got this call, leaving only a pile of bones in the front seat covered in snow. I felt like shit for not finding him that night, but it was really creepy knowing his remains were inches away from where I was searching. Story 4. I was called out to negotiate with a 17-year-old female who had barricaded herself in a bathroom with multiple knives and scissors. She'd done it right too. Sweat ended up going through the sheetrock wall. She wouldn't talk with me at all, but had multiple graphic conversations with her mother, who committed suicide 3 years earlier, and her dad, who's serving lots of years in prison for sexually abusing her. When Swat pulled her out, she had completed multiple circumcisions on herself with the scissors, completely cut her nipples off, and had sodomized herself multiple times with multiple steak knives. The kicker was, she was talking the whole time and her tone or volume never changed. The pain never bothered her. Or more likely, she never felt it. The human mind is scary as fuck. Story 5. Not a cop, but answering 911 lines. Had an open line of a guy yelping, "Ow!" in between thud noises. He didn't respond to anything I said. Turns out, those thuds were the sounds of him chopping off his fingers with a meat cleaver. Had a Good Samaritan call about a guy pulled up in front of a medical center in his car. He had a travel blender plugged into his vehicle and he was bleeding heavily. He had chopped his dick off and put it in the blender. I forget the specifics as to why, but it had something to do with a pending child molestation or rape case. Last but not least, the one that will stick with me, is the woman who called at around 8 in the morning on a Sunday telling me, in an eerily calm voice, that she had killed her baby by bashing his head into the floor because the devil was inside him. I didn't believe her. It was true. Story 6. Got a report of a missing husband. He told his wife and family of 6 children that he was going to get his tires changed, but never returned, and this was 12 hours ago. They had purchased another house in a neighboring community, and the relationship with the wife was under pressure. So the wife assumed he was staying at the other house, and claimed he would never kill himself. The strange thing about this report, though, was that he emptied his personal bank account into his wife's this morning as well. The wife explained this off, saying that they recently had a fight about finances, and he agreed that he was bad at money and maybe they should just have a joint account that she controls. On a hunch, I asked his 14-year-old boy if there were any areas in the mountains nearby that his father enjoyed going, and the son identified a road about 10 miles away. It was nearing midnight, but I decided to drive to the top of this old and abandoned Forest Service road. As I drove through the snow and started to climb the road, I felt a gut feeling that I would 100% find this guy up there either thinking about or already acted out a suicide. The snow-laid gravel road had some sign of travel, but no real indication of how fresh the vehicle tracks could be. As I reached the top of the road after an hour of travel, I was honestly surprised that I did not find his black truck. I spent the drive back down thinking about gut feelings and how they are unreliable, but that I somehow felt different about this one. As I traveled up the road, I did notice over a dozen smaller roads branching off, but they were not mapped, and I had already spent too much time on a single occurrence in a busy city with too few police officers. Nonetheless, I decided to check a single of these secondary roads, and about March 4th of the way down I picked a road at random to check, and sure enough my headlights lit up the back end of a black truck about 100 yards past the first corner. Even if I hadn't memorized the license plate beforehand, I wouldn't have had to run it. It was clearly his. I radioed that I had found the truck, parked my vehicle, and traveled the 20 feet to his truck with my heart beating like I was doing it at a sprint rather than a normal walk. What I found inside was a mess of brains and blood caused by a self-inflicted shotgun wound under the chin. I'll save you from the description. There was just something about that gut feeling while traveling this abandoned and quiet mountain road, followed by a sense of being tricked by the gut feeling, then finding out it was true by discovering such a gruesome scene, having to wait 3 hours next to his truck waiting for body removal, and then to end it all by having to go to the family who was expecting good news to deliver to them the worst news possible. That makes me feel creeped out to this day. Story 7. I responded to a report of an unresponsive infant. When I arrived, all the family members were standing around casually in the front yard pointing into the house. I found the baby in the back room laying on her back on a bare mattress. I started CPR, but realized the baby was probably already deceased. We rushed her out to the arriving ambulance, hoping they had a way to bring her back. I learned she was the mother's second suspicious SIDS death, and I had her other children removed from her care. The difficult part was when I left the scene and went to the ER to see what came of the situation. As I walked in and asked where she was, an ER nurse walked over to me and handed me the deceased baby swaddled in a blanket and told me to wait for someone to show me to the morgue. So I'm standing there in the ER in uniform holding what everyone thinks is a live infant, but rather an infant corpse, and several people stop by wanting to see her and commenting on how cute it is to see an officer holding a baby. I just smiled, but it killed me inside. I was ushered back to the morgue after what felt like an eternity, and told I had to wait with the baby until the medical examiner arrived. They took the blankets off and laid her on a stainless steel gurney and left me alone with her again. I lounged around the morgue for about an hour waiting. By the time I got home several hours after the end of my shift, because this call came out 15 minutes before the end of my 10-hour shift, I laid down on my bed and cried for a long time. My young daughter was in daycare and my wife at work. I really needed to hold both of them, so the house felt incredibly empty. My daughter was only slightly older than the infant, and when I was looking at her earlier, I kept seeing my own daughter. I didn't get any sleep at all before going back in for the next shift later that night. Story 8. My dad worked in a precinct with one of highest crime rates in NYC. I think it had the highest murder rate during his years on the job. Anyway, he won't tell us stories about what he's seen because they're mostly horrific and still give him nightmares almost 15 years off the job. However, I do remember he told us one story when he was really drunk. A woman in her 20s walked into her apartment building late from work one night and was waiting for the elevator. It opened, and the only person in there was a creepy-looking guy. Though apprehensive, she got in and pressed her floor number, but noticed that the basement button was pressed. Normally, after 9 p.m. maintenance would lock the basement button to prevent random people from going down there and fucking with shit. I guess someone forgot to lock it. The creepy guy ended up taking her down there, tying her up, and raping and torturing her for hours. He then took her apartment key, went up to the floor she'd pressed when she'd first gotten into the elevator, tried every door until he found hers, and took her roommate, also a woman in her 20s, into the basement where he continued torturing and raping both of them until dawn. Maintenance found them that morning, and my dad was a responder. Again, my dad never told us stories. This one might have stuck out because he has 4 daughters, but I think it's gotta be up there in creepy factor. Story 9. My father has been an officer for 20+ years, and this story is probably the worst thing he has ever had to do. My father and I were heading to the range one day to sight in our hunting rifles. We were in his police vehicle since we were going to the shooting range for local law enforcement personnel. Dispatch came over the radio to get an officer out to a 911 call of a possible dead body. Many of the officers joked over the radio that it was probably a prank or someone overreacting since it was around Halloween. The responding officer arrives at the scene and calls in that he is going into the woods to investigate. A few minutes later, he sends out a call confirming it's an actual dead body and to get the necessary resources sent out to assist. Then the responding officer personally calls my father because he recognized the body. It was my dad's brother. He had been having rough times and decided to end it by hanging himself from a tree 50 yards into the woods next to railroad tracks. The second worst part was that he had been reported missing for a few months. So by the time they found his body, he was severely rotted. The worst part was that my father had to go to assist in the removal and scene investigation. That day was the first time I ever saw my father cry, and I was in my mid-teens. Story 10. Detention officer at a local jail here. We had a guy get brought in about 2 a.m. one night who we immediately knew was about to give us a fun time based on the way he was moving, quickly snapping the head back and forth, looking all over the room, etc. One of my coworkers and I stay with the booking officer to help her out when the shit inevitably hits the fan. The guy keeps rambling on throughout the whole process. Parts of his speech are understandable, but most of it is gibberish. At one point, he looks up at my coworker and says, "Would you blame me for it?" Trying to keep the guy calm, my coworker tells him, "Nah, man, no one can blame you." For whatever reason, this set the guy off. He leaps off the bench and we both push him back down. My coworker is trying to get handcuffs on his other wrist. He was already handcuffed by one hand to the bench, and I'm holding him against the wall with every bit of strength I have. This motherfucker was strong. I swear the bench was about to come up off the concrete when he first leapt at us. Once my coworker gets handcuffs on him, we take a step back. The guy throws his head back, eyes rolled all the way back, and lets out an inhuman scream that I've only heard in movies about demon possession. He then moves his head as if he's looking around the room, but still with his eyes rolled into the back of his head, and spouts off more nonsense. I'm not Catholic, but I was very tempted to cross myself. The screaming, head throwing back, and eye rolling continue on for about 45 minutes. Every so often he'd come back to reality and talk to us like a normal person for a moment and then go back into crazy mode. Story 11. Got a call for a missing child. Got to the home to find the mother highly distressed and not sure what to do. I called in everyone to first search the home and property. I decided to search the backyard since it was a large wooded lot with no visible fence. After about 10 minutes I found the boy. He was caught on an old chain link fence in the woods that was blocked by a bunch of trees, so you couldn't see it from the house. He had basically gotten strangled to death on the fence. He must have been climbing on it, fell, and got his hooded sweatshirt caught on it. The worst part for me was having to call it in on the radio, knowing the mother might hear it inside from one of the other officers' radio. Story 12. I was new on the force and sent to a home invasion in progress late in the night. I noticed my training officer didn't seem to be too concerned and responded slowly as opposed to the normal emergency response for crimes in progress. Upon arrival, he asked me if I had been to the home before. After I said no, he told me to go handle the call. As I walked towards the home, the garage opened and an elderly lady who was bent at a 90 degrees angle at her waist hobbled out. Without looking at me, she said to hurry due to the fact that the two black male suspects were still in the home. She used much more colorful and racist language. I noted that she couldn't straighten her back and realized she was a bit off mentally. I then walked into the home with her behind me. While my eyes adjusted to the interior, I heard a click. I turned to find the lady locking two padlocks on the interior of the door. I then noted, as we were within the kitchen, that every cabinet and pantry also had a secured padlock on their doors. I looked down the hallway and found that every interior door of the small home was shut and secured with padlocks. I followed the elderly woman down the hall to the second door on the left. She began to unlock the padlock to the door and shouted, "They are in here!" To my surprise, within the room, there was an older white guy sitting at a table using a desktop computer. He looked at me, greeted me, identified himself as the woman's husband, and then went back to whatever he was doing. The woman then pointed at an empty chair and began to yell, "They are under the chair! Oh no, they just ran outside right there." The woman was pointing at a wall. After waiting for the woman to lock her husband back into the room, and then waiting for her to let me out of the kitchen door, I cursed my training officer and hightailed it out of there. That was my first exposure to mental illness, and it was creepy. My training officer said the woman had supposedly been raped by two black males years ago, which had caused her mental break and her animosity towards those of the race. Story 13. Late to the party, but here we go. Also very NSFW. My roommate at the time was a volunteer EMT. He woke me up one Tuesday morning holding a bottle of scotch and saying he needed help. He told me this story as we polished off the bottle. They get a call that all available unit, police, fire, ambulance, first responders, all need to show up at this house. Dispatch tries to explain but just said everyone is screaming and I can't understand what's happening. By the time he gets there, 2 police officers and a first responder are in the yard vomiting. His group runs inside to find the first ambulance crew shaking and crying. Now his crew gets completely concerned, but runs into the bedroom. What he happened to see was something out of a horror film. Blood on the ceiling, blood all over a naked male, and blood all over a naked female. They are both screaming and no one can understand where all this blood came from. They check the male and he has no wounds, so they escort him out and begin to check the woman. In between her legs is a scream of blood, and it looked like her vagina was chewed up by a power tool. And that's when they saw it. Literally. This couple decided to make their own sex machine out of a reciprocating saw. But they decided to slide the dildo onto an actual saw blade. When they turned up the speed, well, guess what happened? Miraculously, she survived. But I'm sure with major irreversible damage. Story 14. Story 14. I got a call that there was an abandoned truck on the highway. I was only a mile or two away, so I headed there. It was in the middle of these curves with a mountain wall on one side and a drop-off to a creek on the other side. It was dark, probably around midnight. I pull up and there it is. An old 50s pickup truck. Light blue. Sitting there. I have no backup. I have no idea where the driver is. I walk up, gun out, inhaling the strong alcohol vapors. No one to be found. I call for a tow truck. Meanwhile, I have to wait, in the dark, in the middle of blind curves, with no idea where the driver is or why he left it. My adrenaline was at an all-time high for sure. Story 15. Just talked about this, but the worst was a dad dropped a giant floor TV on his toddler. Flattened the kid's head like a pancake. Okay, not that flat, but it was definitely badly misshapen. Eyes were bulged out. The child lived for about 4 or 5 hours with a flat head. I've responded to kids being tortured. Guys hanging for so long their body had slid down their spine, making their neck look a foot long. I've seen dead people talk, rigor mortis sets in and you move the body, a gas vibrates the vocal cords making noise. I have seen people crushed by big trucks, smashed in loading docks, die in their homes and eaten by their pets. People start shotguns, pistols, rifles, but none of that compares to having children describe the rape and sexual acts their parents forced them to do or did to them. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe for more Reddit content.